people today would find it funny where an e-commerce website was using a parameter for the price as a hidden value within the page. All you had to do, and you're smiling, but this is actually, early hacking days, is just to, load the source of the page, manipulate that value, and all of a sudden, this product, instead of $1,000, you would buy it for $10, and there was no mechanism to verify the authenticity of the transaction.
And I've got this big thing I'm sort of working through in my head at the moment around trust in the internet from a consumer perspective.
We need to unpack this. As an overarching statement, I tend to agree, it's all about trust. How do you establish trust is the big question. And, early days, for example, websites used to use certificates.
Yeah.
The certificate was, one indicator for authenticity.
Yeah.
And then you had this body in between that issued the certificate, and it was their job to ensure that you are really you.
Do you think that to be a successful site, so you need to have that global exposure?
A simple answer is yes.
Joining us today is Ami Hofman, Vice President of Business Development and Sales, ANZ, at CYFIRMA. With over 25 years of global experience in cybersecurity, Ami has tackled complex challenges across markets from Israel's Bezeq International to major players here in Australia like ANZ, NTT and Accenture. In today's conversation, Ami shares his perspective on why cybersecurity is a team sport, the value of the CTEM approach, and the shift towards more collaborative connected security strategies like the mesh model. With a career built on both technical depth and business leadership, Ami brings frontline insights that are timely, practical, and essential for navigating today's threat landscape. So Ami, thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure, thank you for having me.
We met in the last couple of months, and I really enjoyed our first initial conversation that we had. I found it really insightful into the world of cybersecurity and all the different facets that you've been involved in.
Thank you.
And there's three topics in particular today that I'm really going to lean into to sort of bring to life through our conversation. So the first one is your global career in cybersecurity, how you've shaped that, how you built that. The second one is this kind of a quote that I came across, or maybe you said to me, but cybersecurity is a team sport.
Yes.
And also about, I think I'm saying this right, the CTEM approach.
Yes, continuous threat and exposure management.
And then finally, collaborative cybersecurity. And we'll talk a bit about mesh and some of your the more modern approach that you're adopting. But I'm going to roll back. First. Let's talk a bit about you and kind of establish sort of where you've come through in your career. And understand that you grew up in Israel.
Yes.
And that was a time before computer science. It was probably a thing in the way it is today. So how did you sort of go from growing up in Israel to moving into the world of work, and what was going on as you came out of high school?
I guess I was a curious teenager. I was quite technical, experimenting back home, so I was quite attached. Electronics is the first area I was interested in. I went to high school. There was computerized systems and electronics. There was no computer science, no cybersecurity at the time. I spent after that almost 5 years at Israeli Air Force. First education, computerized systems, signals intelligence, radar detection system. It was interesting times. I was working with a group of American engineers doing some transitioning, building a new system, going out to the field for some experiments. Opened my horizon to different things to explore. Over time, I went and finished my computer science and mathematics bachelor's degree. Just to have the official certificate.
So you kind of came out of high school. You've gone into the Israeli Air Force.
Yes.
I guess that's quite a great way to get exposure to the world, right? Because you're quite sanitized at high school. You're kind of learning, you go to classes, you get a syllabus, you study as per, you're kind of running to the drum of the education. I think anywhere in the world, that's probably the same, right? It's driven by the institution. Then suddenly you're in the workplace. And as you say, you're working with people from different parts of the world. You're actually seeing real life application. And I think that's when the learning really happens, right? And the connection happens. And I was interested there that you then went and did the degree. Did you feel that you needed to go and kind of get the university education to solidify your learning? Or was it kind of like a ticket to play, so to speak, that you felt you required?
It's actually a very good point. When I grew up, and also the environment, my father was a very dominant force in the house.
Yeah.
So there was a process.
Yeah.
You get some education. In the army, I was fortunate enough to be down selected for this specific unit in the Air Force. You finish your degree, you find a good job, and you move on from there. Nowadays, it's very different, I would say.
Yeah.
Back in Israel, many youngsters, young boys and girls, just skip academia because it doesn't necessarily give them the knowledge and skills they need to be successful. So they go straight from to get their education and experience.
Yeah.
I felt I need the theoretical part of it. Just to go through the notion of completing a degree, and it was also with some of what I had in mind potentially down the road from a career perspective. Tick the box. It's gonna become a mandatory requirement at some point. I might as well just get it out of the way. I'd say thinking is very different nowadays. Back in the days, it was just following the process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think working in the world of tech and recruitment in tech, I guess I get to look at a lot of resumes and people's backgrounds. And there's definitely not a divide, that's the wrong word, but there's a lot of people that didn't follow an academic path, even within computer science, and particularly in cybersecurity. People come from all walks of life, from the Air Force, from the police force. Had one guy that started out in Starbucks, serving coffees. Which I find fascinating, because I think most people think of cybersecurity and think of a very technically complex domain. Yet many of the best leaders didn't start there. Now you kind of did in what you did, but it's just interesting. And I guess I was interested in how you then sort of took that into cybersecurity. But I think you've kind of answered that, because you went into sysadmin. And I read something interesting in your background, that you worked for this joint venture, which was between AT&T and Bezeq. I think I'm saying that correct.
That's correct.
And then you had the dot-com bubble burst.
Correct.
And then what I saw interesting in your background is it said the dot-com bubble burst happened, so you segued into a chief security officer role. And what struck me was there can't have been many chief security officers in the early 2000s. It was still like an emerging field. So what did you see that was going on at that time, or what kind of enticed you or made you thought that's something I'm interested in, that I want to go after?
Firstly, it was an interesting exercise. It was something new. It was the first B2B organization. I got to work with probably every vertical possible. Cybersecurity was built in because you see it as a proxy between, for example, the Israeli Stock Exchange and financial organizations, so between critical infrastructure and government. So security had to be built into the stack. So I got my first experience, building secure applications and secure infrastructure. I was quite fascinated. I was opened up because this was also an AT&T investment. I got to spend, time in the US with AT&T. That was an eye opener. AT&T were also trying to replicate a very successful network. They were operating across North America and Europe. It wasn't a completely new thing. Yes, there was a new, technology aspect to it, with Ariba being the main partner. When the bubble bursted, obviously a lot of people lost their job, left the company. There was a vacuum. I got the opportunity, and I embraced this. And initially, I was team lead, and then I took the role of a security officer. Early days of really security officer, and then like a year later. AT&T withdrew their initial funding, and we got acquired by the mothership. And again, there was a VoIP. I had the opportunity to take on board, a full-on SaaS role that was also responsible for fraud, which was interesting. And then, in a big telco environment, It was fantastic. First PCI DSS compliance. Lots of exciting things to do. I did mention this as well. I was a design partner for an organization called Secure Islands that was then acquired by Microsoft and became AIP, Azure Information Protection. When solution was sold on paper and you work with the team and eventually they get acquired by Microsoft, quite fascinating. So I was very fortunate to spend about 5 years with this organization as a CISO.
And perfect timing, right? In the sense that cybersecurity, I guess, was really born out of the sudden emergence of the internet.
Yes.
And people talk about the internet being around sort of since the mid-90s or whatnot, but let's be honest, it wasn't really mainstream till the early 2000s, when most businesses suddenly started to embrace. And my theory is that was probably triggered by Y2K. Suddenly people had to kind of think about compliance that they hadn't thought about, to the potential threat that this Y2K bug, which maybe meant people look at their tech stack a bit more and think about the way they harness technology. And then suddenly the internet is coming along. Businesses start to create e-commerce platforms and move to the cloud. And all of a sudden, before we know it, we have a whole industry that's been birthed. And cybersecurity, probably pre-2000, was just called security.
Yeah.
Right. And then suddenly we're connected, so we have to rethink things. So you've kind of landed at a perfect moment in history when all this had to be created from nowhere. Nothing had been done like this before. Everything was a new creation for the first time.
And I certainly saw the iterations. Was sharing this with my kids. They were looking as if I fell off the sky. I like the fact I had to use a modem, connecting to the universities when I wanted to see, the results for the latest exam. And then you actually had broadband internet, specifically, the different generations of, communication protocols. So industry then focusing on perimeter security. My organization was, again, working closely with the likes of Checkpoint, first perimeter security. And I remember how this was implemented. Nowadays you have fancy appliances with all the lights and, multi-layer security. It didn't exist at the time.
Yes.
The concept of doing, this multi-layer security was only, early days. Then lots of others. For example, the web started flourishing, websites, e-commerce and such. There was early days of e-commerce. Then the concept of web application firewall, because you have lots of cases of online websites, e-commerce websites being manipulated. I use this example. People today would find it funny where an e-commerce website was using a parameter for the price as a hidden value within the page. All you had to do, and you're smiling, but this is actually, early hacking days, is just to, load the source of the page, manipulate that value, and all of a sudden, this product, instead of $1,000, you would buy it for $10, and there was no mechanism to verify the authenticity of the transaction, which brought the idea of a web application firewall, because the web application firewall sits between the end user and this website, and so on, EDR and other technologies. So I certainly was fortunate enough to see the evolutions. If you ask me, and we have this conversation often, like as an industry, are we safer now? Have we actually? I don't think so. I think the industry goes in circles. And the world is different. We can talk about this, the career. I think it's not just technology, cultural changes, reporting lines. There's lots of things that have changed from early days when I took on the CISO role to this current day and age. But I don't think we made real leap jump in terms of cybersecurity. And is this a safer world or not? I don't think so.
I think it's a moving goalpost.
Yes.
So to speak, as in there's always something evolving and new where somebody's finding a different way to use the internet, use access, whatever it could be, for malintent. So you're always trying to play catch up. There's always innovation and different ways to do things. So I think I don't think we'll ever sadly find a position in history where we're safe. But it's interesting because cybersecurity is a consequence of the shift of business to online, isn't it?
Yes.
that's what we're talking about. Like people may talk about Amazon. It doesn't exist necessarily in the physical world. Well, maybe it does to a certain degree, but it's not bricks and mortar. They're not opening stores in the same way that retail traditionally operated. So they have a huge cost saving from an overhead perspective.
Yes.
But then the flip side is they have a huge expense from cybersecurity, right? So the money gets spent somewhere.
Yes.
You can't just operate in a vacuum from safe from these things. And I've got this big thing I'm sort of working through in my head at the moment around trust in the internet from a consumer perspective. And what you just described, I think about how when the internet first came about and e-commerce platforms, we had to relearn our habits to trust this website to place an order to buy something.
Yes.
That it was legit and that the product was going to turn up in the post and arrive as described and everything else. And I think we've become fairly comfortable with that and fairly relaxed. Now, most people would spend money or do an online transaction to buy something of different degrees of value. I did a LinkedIn poll last week where I said, what's the most money you would spend on the internet without seeing the product in person? But what I wonder is now with AI and sort of different iterations and the way that things are evolving so quickly, if that trust is diminishing again, is people kind of go, oh, this is a game changer. Suddenly, is that website real? Is somebody created a deep fake? I was talking to someone last week about this. I bought some tickets for an event that I saw advertised on Instagram. But my first thought was, is that real or fake? Is somebody created a deep fake of this person to promote an event and I'm going to click the link and buy a ticket and the event doesn't even exist? I never thought that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, definitely. Whereas now, so my trust is diminished.
Yes.
I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's what you're talking about. You talk about the fear, the protection.
We need to unpack this. As an overarching statement, I tend to agree. It's all about trust. How do you establish trust is the big question. And, early days, for example, websites used to use certificates.
Yeah.
The certificate was, one indicator for authenticity.
Yeah.
And then you had this body in between that issued the certificate, and it was their job to ensure that you are really you. That was early days. I think the world today is far more complex. Like I was talking to a colleague about non-human identities, which is one of the major hypes in the industry today, being used across various different facets of the business. You can't stop the trend. How do you ensure trust in such a complicated world? I don't think there's an easy answer. Certainly, I bring trust into everyday conversation. There's certainly some effective mechanisms. You take, for example, supply chain. Third and fourth party risk. How do you trust the supplier?
Yeah.
Look at Marks and Spencer and what happened. Through a third party that was compromised in a sophisticated phishing campaign. Deepfake is another one. It becomes quite a big threat. I think AI, in the broader sense, I was in an interesting conference about security and AI about 3 weeks ago. One, organizations were talking about the wide adoption of AI, which is obviously a problem. There is some benefit. Some of it is yet to be proven from a business perspective.
Yep.
But from a security perspective, obviously it's a big risk, right? There's an acronym called Shadow AI. Security is trying to slow down, the adoption across the business. You need to have a, strategy and relevant policies in place. You need to understand what the risk to the business is. And then you need to figure out how you bring security into the conversation. I think it becomes apparent to, daily situations. How do you build trust? We spoke about this earlier. Yep. Our kids in online gaming. I was having this conversation with my younger one because, the identity of the person on the other side, this chat room, it's not called John. It's called, XYZ123. How do you know who's XYZ123? Yeah. Oh, he approached me using this firm. But how do you know who the individual is behind it? So it's very hard. But I think we need to think about trust when we launch these type of services as part of the experience. How do we bring trust? How do we actually ensure that this is an authentic transaction?
Yeah.
One more anecdote, and I use personal experiences. Almost 10 years back, the big hype in the industry was zero trust. Okay? And again, the whole concept is trust should be gained through a series of actions, and trust should be verified continuously, all the time. And the level of access is on a need-to-know basis. When I started traveling the world and speaking to various different organizations in probably all corners of the world was very simple. It was in and out, inside the organization, outside the organization. The perception was in good, outside potentially bad. It was all focused on perimeter security, all right? Then it was early days, for example, of cloud adoption. Industry started talking about East-West, because the whole idea was once you traverse through your whatever multi-layer perimeter security you had, you can basically move laterally, freely. There was no real hurdles within the environment. So having this conversation of where the environment is going, multi-cloud strategy, how do you build those, multi-layer controls, also moving laterally within your organizations, how do you build trust? I think for many organizations, before you even go and speak about trust, they had to baseline, really understand the norm. Now, the norm, you need to understand numbers. When I started doing this, about 18% of the overall traffic mixture was in and out, traversing the perimeter. And about 75% was what we call East-West.
Yep.
And the organization was completely clueless to East-West. Right? So once the dust settled, because zero trust and microsegmentation was, for example, one of the acronyms that came out of zero trust, and some organizations were rushing into solution mode and buying technology, and part of the conversation was, hang on, you really don't have a good appreciation of what's the norm. What are the behaviors? What potentially represents an anomaly? What potentially presents a potential, fraudulent or malicious behavior? We will go back to mesh, but mesh basically goes back to the same concepts of observability, understanding the behaviors, so that you're in a position to understand what's an outlier, potentially fraudulent or malicious activity, and then do something. So I think some of the problems remain as a macro problem. It's just the underlying environment, both physically from an environment as well as culturally, is very different.
Culturally is huge. And I think that's a trend as well. When I sit down with CISOs and talk about these things, the kind of social engineering, the psychology in cybersecurity, I think is enormous. And I think up until this point, this is a huge generalization, but it's been predominantly seen as a technology problem, not a people problem. Or opportunity, whichever phrase you want to use. But I think there has to be more investment in that kind of cyber business partner type role, and less emphasis just on the barriers, because someone's always going to figure out how to get around that barrier. When someone does, you need to make sure you've got the culture to be able to respond and deal with that, I believe.
Which was the key point, and I don't want to steal your thunder with the CTEM, but that was the whole point, and we can talk about this.
Let's pause there. We'll come to CTEM.
Okay.
Because I just wanted, there's one last bit in your career that I'm really interested in, which is you've built an incredibly successful career. No, don't apologize. This is fascinating, and we will get to it. You built a great career in the Middle East, in Israel.
Yes.
And then you moved to Australia. You up to moved here 15 years ago.
Yes.
2010. What made you make that move?
Personally, I always had the drive. As a kid, I wanted to conquer the world, make the world safer. Make the world safer is a an idea that came later on, But obviously, early days, I grew up in a very small town near the beach. For me, first experience working, making my way to the big city, Tel Aviv, was a very different experience. And I always wanted to, conquer the world.
Yeah.
To be honest, when my wife and I were discussing, the next big step, we had two options, or at least I had two options to explore. Either go US or come to Australia. I wasn't as familiar. My wife's sister wasn't here. So that was the angle. She's been here for more than 30 years, always out of Melbourne.
Yep.
So that was, to sweeten the decision easier for my wife. But I did get to spend a lot of time in the US. Retrospective, in hindsight, I think we made the good decision. I think Australia, and specifically Melbourne, at least from a personal, subjective perspective, is a better place to raise kids. And it wasn't easy, specifically when I was carrying, a global, worldwide responsibility to travel different corners of the world from Oz. But I'm very respectful. When I arrived in Australia in 2010, first big junction, and I had to learn quickly. Even at a CV level, I submitted my first CV, just reflecting on my experience, and my initial feedback was, you're overqualified. So in a way, I had to dim down. I didn't want to be a CISO. I very, very quickly realized that the CISO in Australia, and we can talk about this, is very different. I would say high level. The CISO back in Israel is more technology oriented. It's very much hands-on. You grew within the system, and then you took obviously more responsibility. And I think in here, and I speak to you often to CISOs, they sort of drift. And I think specifically, in the current day and age, I think in the future, probably in the near future, CISO role is going to morph into something else, chief risk officer or something else. There's a lot of, upwards management and risk and politics, which was not my sweet spot.
Yep.
A friend recommended the biggest SI at the time, Dimension Data, that was acquired by NTT, and shareholder was Japanese government. As I arrived, I was dealing with, the tier one banks. I was fortunate enough, depends on how you look at it. NZ Bank failed an audit at the time. They brought someone from Lloyd's. He came over to run the business. So basically, the opportunity was to build a security program from the ground up in a tier one bank.
Yeah,
I ended up spending about 4 years there, building their SOC. I was very fortunate, great experience. After 4 years, MSS was the hot potato.
Yep.
NTT acquired Sydney-based business. Initially trying to nationalize this, then we went regional. Then trying to globalize this. In the first 3 years, basically the business doubled. So that was fantastic. And in 2015, I left Australian business within NTT. I took global responsibility. Over time, I became the lead for cybersecurity solutions. In 2016, and that was interesting angle for me back to cyber and innovation back from Israel. NTT became an early investor in Team 8.
Yeah.
The founding fathers, Team 8, came from 8200, which is the Israeli NSA equivalent. NTT became an early investor, and part of my responsibility was from an incubation perspective, basically to take some of the innovative thinking in early companies. This is where companies like Clarity, which was one of the really early portfolio companies we spoke about. We can come back to this about IT and OT convergence. Lots of interesting conversations. I was basically flying to all corners of the world, speak to big accounts, key clients, trying to reflect on what's going on in the market, driving co-innovation, and then bringing some of the thinking back to the factory line, so that NTT keep up to speed with where the market is going, just to stay closely aligned.
So it's interesting, isn't it? You've come to Australia, you've kind of established yourself at ANZ, probably one of the best and the biggest places to do that in Australia. It's also interesting what you described there as being overqualified. I encounter that a lot with people that migrate to different countries, but in particular Australia. They've got great experience in a different country. They rock up and people kind of say, you're going to have to now learn to do that here.
Yes.
And I think that's part and parcel of relocating. You learn quickly not to take that personally and to accept that you've got to kind of learn the local lay of the land, so to speak. But then you've moved into consulting. Do you think consulting is the best environment? Does that bring out the best in you?
I think so. First, and we spoke about this as we were preparing for the podcast. I think specifically at executive level, much of what you do that potentially would dictate how successful you are is the art of storytelling. I like this. I enjoy very much spending time in front of clients, exploring new territories, trying to solve complex business problems and taking this back to my business. I think now more than ever, we can talk about this. I think many organizations struggle with how they present and report on risk, the art of storytelling. This is
where did you learn that skill?
I had probably the best mentors in the world. It's a good question, because if I take a step back, I had to cross quite a few personal boundaries. One, I came from a country that is not English speaking.
Yep.
Yes, I had my my CV learnings, but obviously that's a baseline. And I remember actually took offense initially when I was doing the work, and I got some feedback, and you have some typos, or your English is quite basic, and you get some feedback, but you take it on the chin and you try and improve the next time. First time you present to quite a demanding audience of executives, and that is a good example, because they have a very mature funnel, which means you have to get guidance and advice. You go through gates, you need to get sign-offs, different personalities. It's a tier one bank. You learn this. I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by lots of talented people and friends that, over time, you get to observe people, you take on feedback, you present internally at group level, you present to clients, and you get better over time. I think one of the good things being part of big corporates, whether it's NTT or Accenture, you get to tap into the leadership and the scale and the experience they bring, but also a lot of formal and informal training. I was part of many courses. I remember this one, Present with Impact, right? How do you land the point, convey a specific message from your body posture to tone of the voice, and how, counting, the words, remember this.
This was ANZ, sorry?
This was NTT as an example. This was NTT as an example. And over time, you just use the advice. There's a saying, surround yourself with people you aspire to be like, or you have a lot to learn from. And I was trying to do this with over the years.
And I think it's interesting. I read something recently. It was about polyglots and people that speak multiple languages. And the research was showing that actually the way that polyglots or people learn language is to go and expose themselves to the language, go and speak the language, go and be around, not just study a book and learn the words from the dictionary.
Yes.
Because you get that feedback. People will correct you. They know it's not your native language, so they will correct you and say, you use that verb in the wrong tense, or the word you mean is this, or you don't say. And they're not doing it to be harsh or brutal. They're just helping you to learn.
Yes.
And you may get corrected. I think the research showed when you first learn a language like 500 times a week, or some extreme number, but that's the learning. That's the refinement. It's not sitting there and watching Duolingo, whatever it is.
What people don't realize, and this is the human brain, specifically early on, input was in English. My brain was processing this in Hebrew, and then you have to spit it out again in English. So there's some processing time and potential delay.
Yeah.
Over time, it becomes more effective.
Yeah.
I look at my kids amongst themselves. They only speak English.
Yeah.
They think in English. Hebrew, as an example, becomes a second language to them.
Yeah.
It doesn't work the same, for example, for my wife and I. It just takes time. You get better at it. But people don't realize that this is how the human brain works.
I've got this, I've asked a few people over the years this question that where English isn't their first language, about becoming fluent in English. And I've asked Hayley this question, so she's smiling. When did you start to dream in English? Because to me, that's the ultimate fluency. You've absorbed it. It's become part of your identity. You start to actually dream and visualize and think in that language.
Probably took almost 10 years to get to the point.
That's a really strange question, maybe you weren't expecting today, but
no, that's okay, because I was smiling when you reflected this, and early on, look, the criticism was there. I wasn't taking offense from a personal perspective. Obviously, it's challenging where you work on a 200-page document.
Yeah.
And all the feedback you get is about your grammar and the fact your English is quite basic, right? But you take it on the chin and you learn and you try. Nowadays, they use ChatGPT and other tools just to make it look better. But back in the days, but you get better at it, over time. And I'm a self-learner by definition. I remember I was telling this to a colleague. I'll give you this example. I was early internet days. I was a sysadmin. I really wanted to experience internet days. There was no Windows system.
Yeah.
There was I read about this earlier version of Mozilla that is available for this flavor of a Unix system. But it wasn't a package like today. You double click on it and you install. I had to recompile this. Basically, it didn't work. I manipulated the code.
Yeah.
I got this to compile successfully.
Yeah.
And I was running Mozilla on this system that was early days connected to the internet just to browse the internet. That was a very, very, very different. But it was from a personality perspective, I took this on board.
It's another language you're learning.
Yes.
Right. It's no different to learning English in the sense that you write the code where you get instant feedback because it doesn't work. Right, the computer stops functioning because you've written the code wrong. It's the testing. It's the you have to go back, rework, relook at your workings. I think it's an interesting process of learning that way.
It's also we spoke about this, and specifically in Australia, it's a multicultural community. People come from all corners of the world. I used to travel the world as well. NTT is a really large and complex conglomerate. Various different companies from various different parts of the world. My mother was born and raised in Romania. So as a child, I remember picking up a few words. I know some Romanian. We had a large community of people that came from Russia. And my mother, because it was under communist regime, had to learn a bit of Russian. So I know a bit of Russian as well. Yep. And you have English and you have Hebrew. It's a good tool. And, I always tell my kids, knowledge is power, right? You don't go, to a place without learning some of it, the culture and the heritage. And if you know some of the language as well, it's always, good to collapse some of the traditional walls. And I use this every day.
Well, it's not just knowledge, it's communication is power.
Yes.
And that's what you're speaking to as well. You're learning about the culture, but you're also learning how to communicate that too. Hayley's trying to teach me Vietnamese. Or she has to go. We We do a few words. But it's interesting because I want to learn about Haley's culture and went to Vietnam off a recommendation because we work together, we spend time together.
Yes.
You want to understand where people have come from to be able to relate.
I'll tell you a funny story, and this is it's a personal story. My name is Ami, and Ami has Hebrew meanings. It means my people in Hebrew. And it's quite powerful. Family and friends, everyone knows me as Ami. When I arrived in Australia, so initially, you go and buy a coffee, Amy. First time, Amy. Second time, Amy. Not funny. When HR started, referring to me as a female, I understood there's an issue. So I ended up, I'm recorded, officially with the authorities using my middle name, which is Ben. So occasionally, I go and buy a coffee, I'd use Ben. People will ask, who is Ben? It's part, I'll say it's part of being an immigrant, it's part of the journey. Some people are more culturally aware. So either they understand how to pronounce this, or they would be polite enough to say, what's the right way to pronounce your name? Is it Ami or is it Amy? But when I arrived, people just made the assumption.
Yeah.
So you can see this evolvement from a cultural perspective as well. So I think in every call when I speak to new people, there would be, how do you want us to pronounce your name, which is very different.
It's basic respect, I think.
Yes,
is what it comes down to, and it's interesting because Australia is a country of immigrants. I mean, there's a lot of heritage pre the arrival, right? And I don't want to dismiss that, but the majority of the population are immigrants that have found their way here from another part of the world.
Yes.
I think 50% of Australians have at least one parent born overseas. So I think that is part of the fabric of being here. You have to understand that people are from different parts of the world. They've come from different journeys.
It's a melting pot.
And that's a great thing. I think it's one of the things that makes it an interesting place to live as well.
I agree.
Let's go back to let's talk about being a CISO in kind of context of this. Do you think that to be a successful CISO, you need to have that global exposure?
The simple answer is yes. I took a second to think about this because let's first look at Australia, because I think Australia at the moment have drifted from the rest of the world. As a nation, this industry is about 120,000 employees. Government is saying we need about 60 or 65,000 more until 2030. There's a massive lack of talent in Australia, specifically at executive level. You see lots of first-time CISOs. Some of the people I was fortunate enough to work with have retired already.
Yep.
And you don't necessarily see the next wave, the next generation. So I think you certainly need the exposure, both industry perspective as well as regional and global. This would apply to other geographies as well.
Yeah,
I think if you look at probably US, the biggest and most mature market, the market is more open. I think most CISOs in the US would travel around. They have things like RSA, which is a great opportunity for them to tap into technology ventures and get more education around what's going on. I think the reason I'm saying this, we got to a point where you have to be really smart around what you're doing. Goes back to our initial discussion. Are we actually making progress or not? Probably not. I think as an industry, we probably took 2 steps back. Can we win this? Well, winning starts with baby steps. And this is where you have to be smarter. But you have to be smarter. Again, you need the experience and the exposure.
Yep.
Doing the same thing is not going to take you very far. We can talk about this, but there's lots of examples of running a SOC, running vulnerability and risk management programs, the methodologies, the practices, the metrics we've used in the last 20 years is probably not going to work moving forward, right? And you're not going to be this, in a way, probably the easiest way to define this, to be a successful CISO, you also have to be an evangelist in a way, right? Because just taking what's in the recipe book and applying this is not going to work moving forward. It's a very complex world, and we can unpack this. And this is, in a way, it's missing. I can tell you, speaking to lots of organizations in Australia, feedback from CISOs is, we just focus on hygiene, just trying to make sure, I'm going to retain the job for the next, for the foreseeable future, and then figure out, what we're going to do next after. We're not going to do anything out of the ordinary, and that's a challenge.
So one of the themes we spoke about was cybersecurity as a team sport.
Yes.
Is the team the board, or is the team the security team?
Funny you mentioned this. So again, the simple answer is yes. Historically, many CISOs, and this is where you see the change in the market, consider cybersecurity to be a technology problem. Again, a segue to CTEM, we can talk about this.
Yes.
But there was certainly a complete disconnect. In theory, the security function doesn't own the risk, right? They are merely facilitators. The business owns the risk. But I saw this over the years. Board and exco were, being kept in the dark. Business owner doesn't really understand what the risk posed to the application they're on. The big banks were leading the pack of creating this bridge, this notion of a risk register where you actually have ties to a business owner, but you can still see the disconnect. Now, the world is changing. I had exposure and engagement from both sides, exco, preparing them for board conversation, board presentation and such, also from a board level. And it's funny because you hear the same feedback on both ends. We're being kept in the dark. We're being treated as the enemy. We want to be kept informed. We want to be part of the decision making. I heard from executives, we don't get support and funding. I heard from boards, they only come to us when the business is broken and we're not being kept informed on a day-to-day basis. For example, in the US, you see the emergence of a cybersecurity subcommittee as an autonomous body, professional body that reports directly to the board. The board is more informed and educated, and in many cases they work more collaboratively with technology and non-technology leadership. I can still see the disconnect in here. I think from a regulator perspective, we've seen some changes in Australia. There's personal liability and accountability at board level. Is this driving the right behaviors? I don't think so. Again, speaking to many leaders and organizations, people are focused most of the time ensuring, they're not going to end up in jail, but not necessarily driving the right behaviors, driving the right decisions. In a broader sense, and sorry for the long answer, I think to be successful, because, and this is part of the things I love in cybersecurity, as opposed to many other aspects of technology which are quite static, security is always, it's around the business, it's very dynamic, you have to reinvent yourself all of the time, and everyone have to come to the party in a nutshell.
I think the difficult thing here, and this is from the outside looking in, I spend time around people like yourself, and I feel like my knowledge of cybersecurity is fortunately increasing. But if I look at it from a business perspective, most people that sit on a board are business people, they're investors, they are looking at strategy and saying, we make this decision, we invest this, our expected ROI is this.
Yes.
Suddenly they've got this person's coming along and saying, we need to spend X amount of our revenue on cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And the upside is that we'll protect the business from X threat, but you're not going to get an ROI, right? You're not going to get a return in dollars terms, potentially. Or maybe we will. Maybe that's the storytelling. I'm interested. I'm certainly saying ANZ, and if it's not, their marketing hasn't worked very well. But the television adverts with the Falcon,
Yes.
and about protecting you when you make online transactions. We're protecting you as a customer. And it's interesting when I watch them because I think as a business, they are now marketing to me as a consumer that I should move my banking to them because I'm going to be safer and more secure.
Yes.
In my activities. They're not coming to me and saying, move to us and you get free tickets for the cinema. Or the kind of perks that banking used to sell into consumer banking. It's now security, it's safety. And to me, that's the kind of commoditization of cybersecurity. I don't know what other phrase to use for it, but it's leaning into that to say that we will win more customers if we can demonstrate trust and security and reputation. Because the minute a bank gets breached, it's very hard. I think it takes a long time to come back from that.
Yes.
And you look at this, they have, I don't know who does this, but they do these polls on the least trusted brands in Australia, in the world and so on. And fundamentally, it's always the companies that have been breached. I haven't seen it recently, but last time I saw it, you had people on there like Medibank and Optus. No surprises, right? They got breached. Whether they did, the extent, I don't know.
Casualty as well as
But it was headline news. So the extent of the breach, most people don't know, but the brand is immediately tarnished.
Yes.
It's funny, I watched the Formula One, and I was watching on the weekend, and one of the cars, I forget which one, had CrowdStrike across the spoiler, the front spoiler going around the track. And it's funny, I thought, CrowdStrike, I haven't really thought about them since they had their big outage. And that wasn't a cybersecurity issue, that was a coding issue, right? But I thought, wow, that brand will probably for a long time remain in most people's mind as the brand that essentially shut down the world for about 12 hours. It's amazing how that lives on, isn't it? I don't really want to go with this point, but I think it's just it's interesting. I guess, that's where I'm going. Boards and investing in cybersecurity is a zero-sum game, as in you're spending money to make sure that nothing bad happens. You're not looking to make an investment to see upside. And I think the longer that time goes on in a business where the business is protected and they're not calling upon the cybersecurity protocols they're putting in place, or they're not seeing the benefit of it because it's just allowing them to stay neutral, I just worry that boards kind of lose the enthusiasm or the essence of why they're doing it because they're not seeing the upside.
I think you have a point, but it's not a black and white conversation. So as part of evangelizing the conversation, we started traveling the world, trying to gauge appetite for a concept called security as a business enabler.
Yep.
Right? Would organizations, embrace investment in cybersecurity to really use this as a real business enabler, as a true differentiator? What we realized, one, there wasn't real appetite with most industries. There's different surveys, one with certain consumer goods, they were in a survey. Basically, the question was, how much would you pay? It can be a cell phone, it can be something else, for the product, for it to be more secure. The answer was somewhere around 10% on top, right? So that was the metric. If it's going to be more than this, then consumers are going to be willing to compromise security to some extent. What we also realize is it really depends on the industry. If you're a bank, people will expect security to be inherent.
That's right.
What do you mean? Your service, your application is not secure, and you have to demonstrate this. I was listening to an ad. Doesn't mean who the brand was. Driving in this morning again, talking about using multi-layers of security in their application, just to emphasize, where their differ. You mentioned Amazon before. If you have an e-commerce, online footprint, is someone going to come to you because your service is more secure? Absolutely.
Yeah.
I know, as a consumer, that's one of the aspects, I'm looking at, but it doesn't necessarily apply to every industry. Now, if we unpack this for the rest of the market, which, represents 95% of the market, security is still being seen as an overhead, as an expense.
Yes.
Yes, you're correct. Business is only looking at, how much money we're making, what is the risk to the brand. This is potentially not going to generate additional revenue for us. But this is also where it becomes complicated because, I heard this often, and you learn this as a consultant, because if you speak to a manufacturing organization and you go to the board and you speak about the latest trends in the financial industry and how advanced they are in the thinking, they would say, look, this is fascinating, lesson, but we're not a bank.
Yeah.
We're, a low-cost airline carrier, or we're in a manufacturing organization. Come back and tell me what the neighbor next door is doing.
Yeah.
And they all benchmark themselves. So as you can imagine, Woolies would know exactly how much Coles is spending, vice versa.
Yep.
Similar in every industry. They know what the benchmark is. They're willing to work within a certain tolerance. And with some industries, by definition, your starting point is quite limited.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, with this very difficult starting point, what do? I'll add one more point. And this is where a friend was asking me, we had quite an entertaining conversation the other day, saying, as a security professional, you've been around for more than 30 years. How come you haven't solved the problem up until now? And then the simple answer is, it's complicated. And one of the other elements I wanted to add, because of the market uncertainty and financial fluidity we have now, yes, we have, federal elections behind us and people hoping the market is going to pick up, but most organizations are still very conservative. Even with the very little money you have to spend, you still have to come and basically ask the business for permission on a case-by-case basis. And there's a lot of convincing to be done. So just imagine now, if before you had a budget and you had certain autonomy to go and spend the budget in the right places and go back and demonstrate this to the business, now it's mentally exhausting. You have to go everything on a case-by-case basis, convince the business why they should make the investment and what's the return. Again, there's no monetized value. This is not going to generate more revenue. And it's hard. When I was a CISO, questions were always there. Well, it was very easy to say, I spent $5 million with Cisco or something else. You demonstrate in terms of traction. Questions are becoming, more pointy, nowadays. We've given you $1 million last year. What was the return? So as a CISO, now you need to build a narrative that there was an actual return on investment, that the business is better placed in terms of the risk you were trying to address, in the first place. They tend to forget that the business is not standing in the same spot. You just moved everything to the cloud and your digital footprint looks, very different. You just acquired this other organization. So obviously your risk posture is going to be very different. So it's a very difficult conversation to have.
In most instances in the last 5 years, many organizations have also allowed their workforces to work from home.
Yes.
That's a huge security risk.
Yes.
Just in that one decision, right? Compared to everybody being on premises, on the network, connected to a device. I think that my metaphor for cybersecurity is a bit like buying an insurance policy. You pay the premium every month, and you're kind of waiting, right, for it to pay out in the event that something goes wrong. But if nothing ever goes wrong, you never go back to the insurance company and say, can I have that cash back? Or you don't see the upside. And there's also, it's probably driven by fear a lot of the time, or the potential risk of fear of things that could go wrong. And that's kind of where you start to bump up and pay the extras bits on your policies rather than a base policy. And I think that's sadly the model. That's kind of been built around cybersecurity.
But funny you mentioned this. Earlier days, many organizations, used this because they were, mandated from a regulatory perspective, or as you said, there's a fallback, right? Well, we have this insurance policy if everything goes in flames. Obviously, you don't want this to be your obvious fallback, but things are very different nowadays, right? Yeah. So first, from an insurer perspective, you're expected to demonstrate, the fundamental due diligence, right? Mm-hmm. There's a set of requirements. The same way you would go and buy, an insurance policy from a health perspective. That's right. You need to demonstrate that you're not bringing anything over. Same way from a cybersecurity perspective, you have to demonstrate that you meet certain requirements, that you maintain this over the year. Otherwise, you won't qualify, or your premium is going to go up. I think an interesting, and that was part of the pleasure of working with global organizations and some of the investments. One of the early village members and adapters for the teammate village was the organization Moody's. Now, okay. Moody's, from a credit rating perspective, obviously corporates and also at a national level, they came with the idea, and often when you come with the overall rating, you look at the financial performance for an organization, right? Cybersecurity is overlooked. Yeah. Many cases we saw this. M&A is a good example. You do your financial due diligence. Cybersecurity is either overlooked or looked at as a last step before you sign the final contract, probably just ticking the box. They came with a concept where they wanted to converge the two, which means if you don't maintain the right hygiene, if you're not very mature, if you're not taking cybersecurity seriously, at the end of the day, it's going to impact your credit rating. So initially, they worked with Teammate. They created a portfolio company that over time got acquired by Moody's. Yep. So now they actually have a technology that will help them come with a risk score, call it, that would give them an indication from a cybersecurity perspective, whether you have a decent hygiene or whether you're taking, cybersecurity seriously in terms of the geography you're operating, your respective compliance and regulatory requirements, and it will impact your overall credit rating. One more point I want to mention here, and this is human behavior, and it goes back to the Australian market as well. Organizations understand a stick and a carrot, right? It's just a reality. It's human nature as well, right? And I think at the end of the day, the market needs to have the right balance between, the positive encouragement in the sense of the carrot, and then the potential ramifications in terms of the stick. I don't think this balance exists. So you mentioned Medibank. Medibank was a good example. Look at the fines scheme, changed after the Medibank event. They also had to put something like $250 million aside as assurances for 5 years. But there's still a way to go, right? In terms of, and at the end of the day, as an industry, if we have aspirations as a nation to become, a leading cybersecurity nation as such, we're going to have to find the right balance between the carrot and the stick, to encourage the right behaviors, but then have the right, ramifications at the same time. We're not there yet.
You're absolutely right, by the way. I think, again, it's where I think cybersecurity is just increasingly becoming that say Australia's aspiration to be a leader in this field. It's because they want to be open for business. Yes. They want more people to come in, build their businesses, etc. So it makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about the M&A angle of cyber before. Never really crossed my mind until you brought that up. But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of, it's a generalization, but companies maybe strip cost to bolster the EBIT. to get a better point of sale, to make the business look financially stronger. But actually, what you're saying is that if they can demonstrate a robust cybersecurity practice, that should be a multiplier, an improvement at the other end of the calculation. So, I like that. I think that, again, kind of goes back into what we talked about earlier with storytelling and the board. And I think that is increasingly the role of a CISO or a CSO, is that team sport. It's part of the board.
Yes.
You're one team. You have a collective vision for where the strategy of the business is going, and the CISO is playing that role within that group to make sure the business is protected,
yes.
but also thinking commercially about the way that it's operating. And I think increasingly, I guess my expectation is, you talked about the chief risk officer. I think maybe starting to morph it and get rid of the I is a good thing.
Yes.
Because it's not just a technology problem, it's a business opportunity. And how do we kind of start to move the needle on that? That's the end of part 1. Catch us again next week as we go into part 2. Thank you for listening to Tales from Tech Titans, and be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcast. If you'd like to get more insights about tech careers, then check out the Ember, that's EMMBR LinkedIn page for the latest updates, articles, and engaging discussions.